The champagne hit the marble floor at exactly 9:47 p.m. Nobody moved. Not the waiters standing at attention near the east wall. Not the string quartet that had been playing Vivaldi for the last 2 hours. Not the 200 guests in their designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, all frozen mid-conversation with crystal glasses halfway to their lips. The only person who moved was Marcus Webb. He stepped forward quietly, the way he always did, smooth, unhurried, with the kind of stillness that comes from a man who has learned to control every visible inch of himself. He reached for the linen cloth on the side of his cart and crouched down near the spreading golden puddle without a word. That should have been the end of it. But Gerald Harrington was not the kind of man who let things end quietly. "Faster, boy." 2 words. Spoken loudly enough for the nearest 30 people to hear. Spoken with the casual cruelty of a man who had never once in his 63 years considered that the person in front of him might be anything more than furniture. The room didn't just go cold. It went still, the way a forest goes still right before something dangerous walks through it. Marcus didn't look up immediately. He finished wiping the floor. Folded the cloth. Stood slowly. And then he looked at Gerald Harrington with an expression that nobody in that ballroom could quite read, because it wasn't anger, and it wasn't fear, and it wasn't the nervous, apologetic smile they might have expected. It was something far more unsettling. It was patience. From across the crowded room, a man in a charcoal suit set down his drink very carefully. His name was Daniel Osei, attorney at law, partner at Webb and Associates, and the only person in the entire Whitmore Grand that night who understood exactly what that expression meant. He had seen it once before. 11 years ago. The day Marcus signed the deed, Marcus Webb had been waking up at 4:45 a.m. his entire adult life. Not because anyone told him to. Not because a shift schedule demanded it. But because his father, a man who cleaned offices in downtown Atlanta for 31 years, had told him something when he was 9 years old that never left him. "Boy, the world will try to make you feel small. The only way you survive that is by being the first one awake and the last one to quit." His father hadn't been a philosopher. He hadn't been wealthy or well-connected or powerful in any way the world recognized. But Raymond Webb had been consistent. And consistent, Marcus learned, was a kind of power that most people completely underestimated. Marcus had put himself through business school on 3 part-time jobs and a scholarship that barely covered textbooks. He had graduated with honors in 2001, the same year his mother was diagnosed, the same year his father's knees gave out, the same year Marcus realized that waiting for the world to give him a fair chance was a strategy that would kill him slowly. So he stopped waiting. He started small. A struggling dry cleaning business he bought for $8,000 with money saved across 4 years. He turned it around in 18 months. Sold it. Bought a small commercial property in a neighborhood everyone else had written off. Leased it out. Then another. Then a partnership in a failing bed and breakfast that became, under quiet and meticulous renovation, one of the most reviewed boutique hotels in Savannah. None of this was fast. None of it was loud. Marcus didn't talk about his portfolio at dinner parties because Marcus didn't go to dinner parties where people talked about portfolios. He lived modestly. He drove a sensible car. He wore clean, unremarkable clothes. He called his mother every Sunday morning. And 12 years ago, when the Whitmore Grand, a legendary property with 47 rooms, 3 ballrooms, and a history going back to 1887, came up for sale under circumstances that had left the previous owners scrambling and desperate, Marcus Webb had walked into that negotiation the same way he walked into every room. Quietly. The sellers assumed he was a representative. An intermediary. The man in the room while the real buyer waited elsewhere. They had offered him coffee with a certain tone. Directed their questions to the lawyer beside him. Spoke as though Marcus might not understand the documents being placed in front of him. Daniel Osei had started to say something once, protectively, the way good attorneys do. Marcus had touched his arm briefly. Not yet. Marcus had read every page. Asked precise, surgical questions. Identified 3 valuation errors the sellers hadn't caught and 1 zoning amendment that would increase the property's worth significantly within 5 years. He had then made his offer, fair, clean, and non-negotiable. The sellers had signed. And Marcus had become, at 38 years old, the sole owner of the Whitmore Grand. What nobody outside of his legal team knew, and what Marcus had no intention of broadcasting, was that he had spent the following decade expanding the property, restoring it to a standard of excellence it hadn't seen since its early years, and quietly building it into the anchor of a small but profitable hospitality group. He had also made one personal decision that Daniel had argued against for years. Once a month, Marcus put on a uniform. He took a cart. And he worked a shift, front of house, back of house, kitchen, maintenance, or cleaning crew, rotating quietly through his own hotel the way a captain might walk the deck of his ship in the dark. You need to understand what your people are living, Marcus had told Daniel once. And I need to remember where I came from. Daniel had shaken his head. But he had stopped arguing. Until tonight, Gerald Harrington had never worked a day in his life that he didn't own. His grandfather had built the Harrington family fortune in textiles, a fact Gerald mentioned within the first 15 minutes of meeting nearly anyone, as though age and inheritance were personal achievements. His father had diversified the portfolio. And Gerald had spent the last 30 years coasting on that diversification with the serene confidence of a man who had confused wealth for wisdom so long ago that the confusion had calcified into identity. He was not, by the standards of his circle, an unusual man. He was loud at charity events and quiet at board meetings. He tipped 20% when people were watching and nothing when they weren't. He told himself he was generous, honest, and self-made in spirit if not in fact, and he had surrounded himself entirely with people who agreed. His wife, Catherine, was elegance and ice in equal measure. She had married Gerald at 24 with her eyes open and her expectations clear, and she had spent 3 decades becoming exactly the woman that world wanted to see, poised at galas, cutting in private, and utterly allergic to any situation that threatened the curated perfection of her public image. Their son, Brandon, was 29 and worse than both of them together, because he had the cruelty of his father and the intelligence of neither parent, and he had grown up in the social media age where performance was currency and humiliation was content. When Brandon pulled out his phone in that ballroom, it wasn't impulse. It was instinct. He had 400,000 followers. His brand was unfiltered luxury. And what was happening 10 feet in front of him, his father standing over a black janitor with that contemptuous tilt to his chin, the champagne still spreading across the marble, was exactly the kind of moment Brandon's audience ate up. He framed the shot carefully. Tilted it slightly to make his father look commanding. Made sure Marcus's gray uniform was visible. And posted it with a single caption. Some people know their place. It got 12,000 likes in the first 7 minutes. What happened next shocked everyone. By the time the gala wound down around midnight, the clip had been viewed 800,000 times. By 3 a.m., it was over 2 million. By morning, the name Whitmore Grand was trending nationally, not for the charity it had supposedly been celebrating, not for the $1,200 plates, not for the auction that had raised money for a foundation nobody could now remember. It was trending because of 2 words. Faster, boy. The comments were a wildfire. Some people defended Gerald in the particular way that revealed more about themselves than they intended. But most of them, the tide of it, the unstoppable digital current, was outrage. Pure, scalding, immediate. News desks picked it up by 6 a.m. By 8 a.m., a producer from a national morning show had emailed the Whitmore Grand's public-facing contact address requesting a comment. By 9 a.m., 2 more had called. In his office on the 14th floor, a corner suite with windows overlooking the bay, a room no guest had ever seen and whose existence most staff were only vaguely aware of, Marcus Webb sat with a cup of coffee and watched the coverage on his laptop. His face was unreadable. Daniel arrived at 9:15, slightly breathless and carrying two phones, the way attorneys carry two phones when things are accelerating faster than planned. Marcus. He set both phones on the desk. We need to talk about your options. Good morning, Daniel. It's not a good morning. It's a situation. He pulled up a chair without being asked. The video has been picked up by 6 major outlets. Your PR contact has been calling since 7. There are people outside the hotel, not many yet, but some. The charity board is calling to ask if last night's event is going to be associated with. Sit down, Daniel. Daniel sat. Marcus turned the laptop so Daniel could see the screen, not the news coverage, but something else. A spreadsheet. Columns and rows in clean, ordered type. I've been going through the Harrington Group's recent activity, Marcus said. Did you know they've been trying to acquire the Beaumont property on Cypress Street? Daniel blinked. What does that have to do with? They've made 3 offers in the last 14 months. Each one declined. Marcus picked up his coffee. The Beaumont is owned by a holding company. That holding company's parent organization is Marcus. Daniel leaned forward. Are you seriously telling me that? I'm telling you to read the document I sent you last night at 10:30 p.m. Daniel picked up his phone. Found the email. Opened the attachment. The color shifted slightly in his face. You've known about the Harrington connection for months, Daniel said slowly. 6 months, Marcus confirmed. And last night was not an accident. The room was quiet for a long moment. Marcus, Daniel said carefully. What exactly are you planning? Marcus looked out at the bay. A boat was cutting through the early morning water, leaving a clean white line behind it. Nothing, he said. I'm planning absolutely nothing. He smiled. It was the same smile from the ballroom. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. We were completely wrong to think this was over, the Harrington family's publicist issued a statement at noon. It was 4 paragraphs of polished language that somehow managed to apologize without apologizing, contextualize without explaining, and express regret without accepting responsibility. The word unfortunate appeared twice. The word mischaracterized appeared once. Gerald himself was described as a man of deep charitable commitment, a description that the internet immediately and mercilessly dissected. Brandon deleted his post at 11 a.m. It didn't matter. It had been screenshotted, mirrored, downloaded, and redistributed 10,000 times before he'd even woken up that morning. By afternoon, 2 of the Harrington Group's corporate partners had quietly announced they were reviewing their relationship. A third, a luxury goods brand that had been co-sponsoring the Harrington Charity Gala for 11 years, issued a statement that didn't mention Gerald by name but left absolutely no ambiguity about what it meant. Gerald held a family meeting in the study of his Beacon Hill townhouse at 4 in the afternoon. He stood at the head of the table the way he always stood, shoulders back, jaw forward, the unconscious posture of a man who had never genuinely doubted his own authority, and told his wife and son that this would blow over. These things always blow over, he said. The news cycle is 48 hours. 2 days from now, something else will be outrageous, and this will be forgotten. Catherine said nothing, but her hands were folded very tightly in her lap. Brandon was scrolling through his comments and not entirely listening. Dad, Brandon said, not looking up. Someone's posting about the hotel. What about it? About the ownership of the hotel. Brandon finally put the phone down and looked at his father with an expression that was, for the first time, something close to uncertain. There's a researcher, one of those deep dive account people, who's been looking into the Whitmore Grand's corporate structure. Gerald frowned. Why would anyone? Because of the video. Because people are looking for everything now. Brandon turned his phone around. On the screen was a social media post, amateur research, the kind that gets assembled in real time by people who know how to use public records. Ownership filings. Corporate registrations. A holding company name. Gerald read it. Read it again. That's wrong, he said. Is it? A long silence settled over the room. Call my attorney, Gerald said finally. And for the first time since the champagne hit the floor, Gerald Harrington's voice carried a tremor in it that had nothing to do with age. The researcher's name was Priya Nair, and she had 17,000 followers and a reputation for finding things that powerful people assumed were buried. She had started with the video, same as everyone else. But where most people had reacted emotionally and moved on, Priya had started pulling threads. The Whitmore Grand was a beautiful property. Historic. Well-reviewed. Expensive. And when she had searched its corporate ownership, the way she searched every property that appeared in a story that felt like it had deeper roots, she had found something that made her pause. The hotel was owned through a holding entity registered in Delaware. Standard enough. But the parent company of that holding entity was a firm called Webb Hospitality Group, which had a principal whose name appeared in exactly one publicly accessible document, a state-level business registration from 12 years ago. Marcus J. Webb. She had cross-referenced the name against the hotel's staff records, which weren't public, but she had found a photograph. A candid shot from a local business journal profile 7 years ago, small and easy to miss, about the quiet expansion of independent black-owned hospitality businesses in the Southeast. In the photograph, a man stood in front of a hotel entrance. He was wearing a suit. He was smiling. He had the same face as the man in Brandon Harrington's video. The same man in the gray uniform. Priya had stared at that photograph for a long time. Then she had posted her findings with the caption, "You might want to sit down for this." Within 3 hours, it had been shared 40,000 times. What happened next changed everything. Gerald's attorney called with some initial reassurance. The ownership structure was complex. The name could be coincidental. The photograph was low resolution and old. None of this was confirmed. None of this was a confirmed, verified, unambiguous fact, and until it was, Gerald was advised to stay calm and let the noise settle. Gerald had wanted to believe that. He had wanted to believe it badly enough that by evening, he had half convinced himself. Across the dinner table, with the finest wine from his cellar and food prepared by his private cook, he had even managed a laugh. "You know what this is," he told Catherine. "This is the internet making something out of nothing because people have nothing better to do." Catherine looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Gerald," she said quietly. "It'll be fine." She said nothing more. But she pushed her food around her plate without eating and left the table early. Brandon had gone upstairs after 1 glass of wine. He hadn't said much since the afternoon meeting. His phone had been quiet, which was its own kind of bad sign. Brandon's phone was never quiet. Gerald sat alone at the long dinner table, with the chandelier burning overhead and the sound of the city filtering in from outside, and told himself he had handled worse. He had, in fact, handled worse. But he had never faced worse while standing in a room that someone else owned. That thought came to him as he was finishing his wine, and it came without warning, and it sat in his chest with a weight he couldn't quite place. He pushed back from the table. Went to his study. Opened his laptop. He searched the name. Marcus J. Webb. The Business Journal article loaded slowly. The photograph was small. Gerald leaned closer. The wineglass in his hand tilted without him noticing, and red wine spread across the corner of his desk like a slow tide. He didn't reach for a cloth. He just stared at the screen. They thought the fight was over. They were completely wrong. What Gerald didn't know, what almost nobody knew, was the full history between the Harrington Group and Marcus Webb. It had started 10 years ago, before the Whitmore Grand had become what it was. In those early years, when Marcus had been renovating the property and pouring everything he had into making it viable, the Harrington Group had made an approach. Not a friendly one. They had wanted the Whitmore Grand's location, the waterfront position, the historic designation that came with certain tax advantages, the footprint that would have served as an anchor for a development project the Harrington Group was quietly assembling. They had sent a representative, a smooth, suit-wearing man named Franklin Cross, who had met with the property's listed management company, never connecting the meeting to Marcus directly, and made an offer for the hotel. The management company had forwarded the offer to Marcus. Marcus had declined. Franklin Cross had returned with a second offer, larger, more insistent, with language that walked the edge of pressure. Still declined. Then the Harrington Group had taken a different approach. Not a legal one. There had been a period, 18 months of it, during which the Whitmore Grand had faced a series of complications that, individually, looked like bad luck. A building inspector who cited violations that had never been flagged before. A supplier who suddenly couldn't fulfill contracts. A bank that had been carrying a line of credit for the hotel's renovation, which abruptly changed the terms in ways that shouldn't have been permissible. Marcus had spent those 18 months fighting every single one, quietly and methodically, keeping the hotel operational through sheer refusal to yield. Daniel had found a connection to the Harrington Group during the third month. A paper trail, thin, but real. The building inspector had a brother-in-law who worked for a Harrington subsidiary. The supplier had received a contract from a Harrington-affiliated firm the same week he'd broken his agreement with the Whitmore. The bank's loan officer had attended 2 private events at Harrington properties in the months preceding the terms change. None of it was provable in a courtroom. All of it was real. Marcus had documented everything. Filed everything. Waited. And then, methodically, over the following years, he had done something that Gerald Harrington would have found completely incomprehensible. He had built something better than revenge. He had made the Whitmore Grand so successful, so well-reviewed, so deeply embedded in the local hospitality and business community, that the Harrington development project had quietly failed. The assembled properties they'd been acquiring lost their anchor value without the Whitmore. The tax positioning collapsed. The projected returns that the Harrington board had been promised never materialized. Gerald had lost $3 million on that project. He had never known exactly why it had failed. He had never connected it to a man named Marcus Webb. Until now, Marcus called Gerald Harrington personally on a Tuesday morning, for days after the gala. He used the hotel's main business line, from his office, with Daniel present and a recorder running, not for legal purposes, but because Marcus believed in complete records. Gerald answered on the third ring. "Mr. Harrington," Marcus said. "My name is Marcus Webb. I'm the owner of the Whitmore Grand. I believe we have some things to discuss." The silence on the other end lasted almost 6 seconds. When Gerald spoke, his voice had been reconstructed, the old authority pressed back into place through visible effort. "Mr. Webb. I see. I wasn't aware that you were the owner." "Yes." Marcus's voice was pleasant. "I thought it would be more respectful to speak directly rather than through the press or through attorneys. I prefer that approach when it's possible." Another pause. "What is it you want?" "I don't want anything, Mr. Harrington. I wanted to introduce myself properly, since we were in the same room last Saturday and the introduction was incomplete." A brief pause. "I also wanted to let you know that I've reviewed the Beaumont property situation. I understand you've been trying to acquire it." Gerald's breathing became slightly audible. "That's a private business matter." "Of course. Most things are, until they aren't." Marcus moved a paper on his desk. "The holding company that owns the Beaumont has been considering several options for that property. I happen to have a relationship with the principals. Not a controlling relationship, just a relationship. The kind you build over time." "Are you threatening me?" "No," Marcus said simply. "I'm introducing myself." A long, taut silence. "Mr. Webb," Gerald said finally, with the tone of a man who was accustomed to determining the terms of every conversation he entered. I want to be clear that what happened at the gala was. I know what it was, Marcus said. The room went quiet again, both rooms, 30 miles apart, the same silence pressing into both of them from different directions. I'll be in touch, Marcus said. Have a good morning. He ended the call. Daniel let out a long breath. Marcus, he said. I know. You've been planning this for 10 years, Marcus said. He stood up and walked to the window. The bay was silver-gray under morning clouds, and a container ship was moving slowly toward the port. Not revenge, Daniel. I told you. I've been building toward a correction. There's a difference. Marcus turned around. And for the first time in all of it, all of the composure and the patience and the careful stillness, there was something behind his eyes that wasn't entirely calm. My father cleaned offices for 31 years, he said. He never once walked into a room and was seen. Not by the people who mattered. Not by men like Gerald Harrington. A pause. I've been seen now. And what Gerald Harrington does with that information is going to tell us exactly what kind of man he actually is. Daniel was quiet for a moment. And if he doesn't do the right thing? Marcus turned back to the window. Then I have documentation going back 10 years, he said quietly. And a very good attorney. The Harrington Group's emergency board meeting happened on Thursday. Gerald had called it himself, framed as a strategic review, which everyone in the room understood as a crisis response. 3 board members had requested it independently anyway. The social media coverage had not faded the way Gerald had predicted. It had deepened, because Priya's research thread had been picked up by 2 investigative journalists who had their own reasons to look into the Harrington Group's business practices. One of them had found the building inspector connection. The story published on Wednesday morning had nothing to do with a hotel gala anymore. It was about a pattern. About the ways the Harrington Group had spent decades operating in the gray spaces between legal and ethical, leveraging relationships and pressure and informal networks to clear paths and eliminate obstacles, and how, in at least one case, those tactics had been deployed against a small business owner whose only offense was declining to sell. The article didn't name Marcus by choice. He had spoken with the journalist off record and had been clear about what he was and wasn't willing to have published. He wasn't interested in a takedown. He had said something that the journalist had found, she later admitted, almost unnerving in its clarity. I want people to understand what happened. I don't want a spectacle. There's a difference between justice and performance. The board meeting was tense. 2 members asked Gerald directly whether the article's characterizations were accurate. Gerald's responses, careful, lawyered, long, told those board members everything they needed to know without technically telling them anything. The luxury brand partnership was formally ended that afternoon. 2 corporate clients sent quiet notices of contract non-renewal. The charity foundation issued a statement distancing itself from the Harrington name. And then, on Friday, 6 days after the gala, Gerald Harrington walked into the Whitmore Grand at 2 in the afternoon. Not to a back office. Not through a service entrance. Through the front door. Marcus was in the lobby when he arrived. Not by accident. He was standing near the concierge desk, wearing a suit, not gray this time, but deep navy, well-cut and quiet in the way that expensive things are quiet. He watched Gerald cross the marble floor that Gerald had never known belonged to someone else, and he waited. Gerald stopped a few feet away. He looked older than he had 6 days ago. The architecture of his confidence had shifted in some structural way that was visible if you knew where to look. Mr. Webb, he said. Mr. Harrington. Marcus didn't extend his hand. He didn't withhold it pointedly either. He simply stood, present and unhurried, in the way he'd stood his whole life in rooms that didn't know who he was. Shall we go upstairs? They rode the elevator together in silence, the owner and the man who hadn't known there was an owner. When the doors opened on 14, Marcus led Gerald through the corridor and into the corner office, and gestured to the chair across from his desk. Gerald sat. For a moment he looked at the view, the same bay, the same morning light Marcus had been watching all week, and something moved in his face that might have been, in a different man, something like shame. "I want to apologize," Gerald said. Marcus waited. "What I said, what I called you, that was wrong." The words came out stiffly, imperfectly, the way words come out when they're being said for the first time by someone who doesn't have practice with them. "I was wrong." "Yes," Marcus said. "You were." Gerald looked at him. He had expected more conditions, more confrontation, more performance of power. And Marcus gave him none of those things. Just agreement. Just the calm, unadorned acknowledgement of a fact that both of them already knew. "My son's post," Gerald started, "is a separate matter that your son will need to address himself," Marcus said. "I'm not interested in punishing your family, Mr. Harrington. I'm not interested in destruction." A pause. "I am interested in accountability." "Which is different." Gerald's hands shifted on his knees. "The article," Gerald said. "I didn't speak to the journalist about you." "I know. She told me that." He paused. "Why?" Marcus considered the question. "Because the story worth telling," he said finally, "isn't about what you did to me. I built something beautiful in spite of it. I'm still here. The story worth telling is about the thousands of people who couldn't do what I did, who faced the same pressure, the same manipulation, the same casual erasure, and didn't have the resources or the documentation or the legal support to survive it." His voice was even. Not angry. Something that cut deeper than anger. "That's what I want people to think about when they think about this week. Not you." The room was quiet for a long time. Gerald nodded, slowly, like a man processing something he would spend years not entirely finishing. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Marcus opened a folder on his desk and slid it across. "There's a small business development foundation that works with black entrepreneurs in the Southeast. They're underfunded. They fill a gap that no one else is filling." He tapped the folder. "I want the Harrington Group to fund them. Not a one-time donation. An endowment. A real commitment." He paused. "I want your attorney to review the figures and come back to me within 2 weeks." Gerald looked at the folder. Looked back at Marcus. "That's it?" "That's what I want from you," Marcus said. "Your son will deal with his own consequences. The business practices your company engaged in 10 years ago, those are already in the public record now, and what happens with them is out of both our hands." Gerald picked up the folder. He held it for a moment like it was heavier than it looked. "I underestimated you," he said. Marcus looked at him steadily. "You didn't underestimate me," he said quietly. "You didn't see me. That's a different problem. And it's yours to fix." The Harrington Group announced its endowment of the Southeast Black Entrepreneurship Foundation 6 weeks later. The press release was straightforward. No elaborate narrative, no self-congratulation. Marcus had insisted on that in the agreement. The foundation's work would be the story, not the donor's rehabilitation arc. Brandon Harrington's social media following dropped by 120,000 in the weeks following the gala. More significantly, 3 brand partnerships ended without renewal, and the content deals he'd been quietly assembling fell apart as the story of his post, and his framing of it, the calculation behind it, became part of the larger conversation. He issued a public apology that was, by most accounts, a year too late and a depth too shallow. He was 29 years old and had, for the first time in his life, encountered a consequence that money couldn't simply dissolve. Whether that consequence would change him was something only time would tell. The investigative article about the Harrington Group's business practices prompted a formal inquiry from a state attorney general's office. The building inspector's brother-in-law became a person of interest. Franklin Cross, the smooth representative who had carried those pressure campaigns a decade ago, quietly resigned from the subsidiary where he'd been working and could not be reached for comment. Gerald Harrington stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the Harrington Group in the spring. His statement cited a desire to focus on philanthropic commitments. His board, reading between those lines with the fluency of people who spoke that language, began a restructuring process that several analysts noted was long overdue. Priya Nair, the researcher who had unraveled the ownership thread, was hired by a long-form journalism outlet and began a series on corporate accountability in the hospitality sector. She sent Marcus a brief email when the first piece published. He replied with 2 sentences. "The work matters. Keep going."